Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the next of EMPA's free webinars. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Turrbal people, and we pay our respect to their elders and all the elders throughout Australia and other countries from which you might be listening, elders past, present, and future. And we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Welcome, everybody. If you've attended an EMPA webinar previously or on any other various online events using this platform, you're probably pretty familiar with the controls and buttons on your screen. Just jump into the chat panel at any time to talk to panelists and to ask questions. Just be sure to have chat with everyone selected at the top of your chat window so that everybody can see your comment. Today's presentation will be a general discussion from our incredible experts into which we will integrate all the questions and the comments that you bring to the table. Type your questions into the Q&A panel at any time during the webinar. If you have any issues or questions and can't access the chat, shoot us an email at conferences@empa.org.au. Today's webinar is called The Seat at the Table, and it's a panel discussion on the first of EMPA's recently published principles, which you can read in full on our website. Please join us today for this discussion. Michelle Poole from FENZ, Leah Horner from QFES, and Tony Pearce, Inspector General for Emergency Management in Victoria. Just to give you a little bit of background into these incredible people, Michelle Poole has been part of the evolving practice of public information management for over 25 years, acting as a public information manager in floods, fires, earthquakes, storms, and man-made hazards. She has deployed to several of New Zealand's most significant emergency responses, including the Christchurch and Kaikoura earthquakes, the wreck of the Rena, Cyclone Fehi, the Pigeon Valley fire, and the Westport floods. She's a member of the New Zealand Emergency Management Assistant Team and Maritime New Zealand's National Oil Spill Response Team, as well as being a fellow of EMPA. In her day job, Michelle is part of Fire and Emergencies Communications team. Please, everybody, welcome Michelle. Leah Horner is the Manager of Partnerships and Sponsorship Unit, Community Capability and Volunteerism for Queensland's Fire and Emergency Services. With more than 20 years of experience in development of stakeholder and partnership opportunities, sponsorship, public relations, event and project management, Leah is an innovator and initiator of change. We love that, within public, private and not-for-profit sectors. Leah has enabled collaboration through execution of multi-million-dollar partnership agreements and frontline community projects delivering real, positive and measurable social inclusion and well-being outcomes. Leah is passionate and driven to create and affect change and look for opportunities to connect community, government and industry to help resolve social impact challenges. Welcome, Leah. Tony Pearce is the Inspector General for Emergency Management in Victoria. Tony was appointed Victoria's first Inspector General for Emergency Management in July 2014. An independent governor in council statutory appointment, Tony works closely with emergency management sector partners and the community to strengthen Victoria's emergency management arrangements and enhance community safety. For nearly 40 years, he's worked in intelligence, security, and emergency crisis management, performing senior operational functions in a number of Victorian emergency service organisations before moving to senior crisis coordination and policy positions. Tony has held a number of senior roles in both state and federal government, including 4 years in the role of Director General, Emergency Management Australia. Welcome, Tony. Thank you all for joining us here today. And obviously a seat at the table is an important idea for all of us before, during and after emergencies. But before the questions come flooding in, I might ask you something that I would like to know. For me, this is central. We need to improve our capacity as communicators to influence operational decisions and connect into operational objectives. To do that, I believe we need a seat at the table. I'd really like to hear from each of you why you think that is an important thing, getting the communications and engagement people round the same table, having the same conversations with operational leadership. Leah, I believe that you work before the event, you work building resilience. So perhaps we might start with your insights into this space.
Yeah, before I talk about that, and thank you so much, I'm so glad to have a seat at this table today. I just wanted to preface that with the fact that QFES takes this very seriously, and we have only recently stood up a public information and warnings unit that currently employs 9 people at state level, so as we can integrate our systems and definitely have a seat at the table. And that particular team sits within our state ops branch. We are at the moment trialling a pilot regional model. So, you know, this sort of thing won't happen overnight, but it is happening. So that's really exciting for QFES. My particular area in partnerships and sponsorship is super interesting because we work very closely with our partners. We have key corporate relationships that support our volunteering services. And through those partnerships, we have the ability to communicate and engage with community, specifically with disaster preparedness. So having a seat at the table for us means that we're working really closely with organisations like Suncorp, with the insurance sector, financial sector, so as we can communicate to more people than we would have been able to without them, which is super exciting. So yeah, that sort of sums it up for me.
Michelle, you have done many hours at the pointy end during response, and I know that in that space there is never enough time and there is never enough resources, and there is always a sense of how do we get the job done? How do we have the conversations we need? Tell me a little bit about what seat at the table means for you. Oh, can't hear you at the moment, Michelle. Yes.
Technical fail. Sorry about that.
That's part of life.
You know, the seat at the table is absolutely fundamental for me from the operational perspective, you know, as somebody who is deployed when something happens. But, you know, this is not a new issue. I remember my first EMPA conference in 2009, just after the Black Saturday bushfires, I think, and Bruce Esplin, Tony, one of your predecessors, he spoke at the conference, and what he said is seared into my brain. And he said that communication is the thing. And if you don't get the communication right, it won't matter what you've done with the fire trucks and the rest of the response, you will be judged to have failed. and I know he said that because I was taking copious notes and I wrote it down with quote marks around it. That has been my guiding thought ever since, and fundamental to achieving what we need to do is having the seat at the table. And you know, there are many seats and many tables, and sometimes you have to get in the room first. You know, happily, I think there's been a degree of enlightenment in the years since then, and communications tends to be in the room and at the table, or at least, you know, sitting on the fringes of it in New Zealand emergency response these days, in most cases, but not always. So, you know, how we do it is partly educating those who are the gatekeepers, who are allocating the seats, if you want to keep using that analogy, and partly it's empowering our people, our communicators, to be a little bit pushy, to advocate for the value that we bring, to show the good job that we do and the value that we add. So, you know, there will always be another table that we should be sitting at, but from a purely response perspective, we're getting there, but it's not good enough yet. So I think this is a brilliant forum to have that discussion and to think how we can encourage those of our colleagues who are still feeling excluded or are diffident. You know, so that's, I think, something to explore.
What happens if we're not at the table, Michelle?
I think we've all seen it. There are, you know, as the principles, I think, lay out, if the public don't think they've been well communicated with, they look harshly on whatever has been achieved. And what tends to happen if the communications isn't good is you get mixed messages, you get lack of clarity, lack of timely, relevant information coming through to those who desperately need it, and all the other people who have an interest, a legitimate interest in whatever's going on.
So part of this is making very clear organizationally the value of creating credibility and trust.
Absolutely.
And you do that through communication. Somebody, Shane, said to everyone, are communication professionals still missing from the table? My sense is that multi-agency communications coordination is a powerful network of professionals that pop up in your emergency and go, phew, Michelle and co are here. Before I ask you, Tony, to speak from the operational perspective, does anybody want to respond to Shane?
I think one of the best things that can happen to an emergency communicator when they turn up in an EOC is somebody says, thank God you're here. Because what occasionally still happens is, oh, we didn't ask for a PIM. Why are you here? So, you know, what Shane's described is the ultimate, that they welcome you in. Yeah.
So, Tony, from an operational perspective and also from a recovery perspective, and also that period of time between response and recovery, where things are still being cleaned up and we're moving from one phase into another, what is important to you in terms of what communicators and engagement professionals bring into the decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And I guess my comments would be around the fact that it really doesn't matter which phase you're in or how you interpret where you are in the process. Good communication is critical regardless. So if I take myself, for example, my job is to conduct inquiries and reviews. They're very public facing. They get tabled in Parliament. Everybody gets to see the outcome of them, and agencies and communities are affected by the recommendations that I make. So therefore, if I take the operational functions that I have, both during the emergency and afterwards, without having people who know how to communicate on my behalf to actually describe what it is that I'm trying to achieve. So, you know, I know very, very well how to conduct inquiries and reviews, but I'm not a communications specialist. Therefore, I need somebody to be able to interpret that and then engage with those that are going to be at the back end or at the front end rather of what we're doing to make sure they understand what it is that we're trying to achieve, and to provide them the opportunity to be able to contribute that back into that again. Communications also, it's not just about benevolence. It's not about doing the right thing for others. It's also about, if you don't do it properly, as Michelle's already eloquently described, we will be seen to have failed. And it's not just about being seen to have failed. If you are seen to have failed, then in effect you have. And it doesn't matter who the individual is. Perception is reality for everybody. And without good communication, without people who know how to actually provide that for you, you're in a world of hurt. Again, finally, from my perspective, it's about turning an operational decision into a strategy of communication that actually delivers the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And the only way to do that is to have people who are trained in both communication and community engagement. It's as simple as that.
From the point of view of somebody who's looked at a lot of lessons learned, what percentage of those, just off the top of your head, what percentage are about problems with communication?
I'll preface my response to that by saying first, we need to acknowledge that our system and collective systems are not actually broken. So our environment changes all the time. Therefore, the way in which we approach the issue has to change all the time as well. So I think if you're always looking at improving what you've got from a reasonable base, then you're probably going to get better outcomes than trying to be perfect. That's the first thing I'd say. As far as the engagement part, sorry, I've tripped myself up by putting that preface on the front. Could you just repeat the question again for me?
The question is, how much stuff goes wrong with communication? How many parts of inquiries actually could have been solved by better communication?
Virtually every part of the inquiry. If you look at the Victorian bushfire inquiry or the inquiry into our last fire season that we've just completed, in both phase 1, which looked at response and preparedness for those fires, and then relief and recovery in phase 2, communication issues permeate throughout. There's no doubt about that. But once you get into the recovery part, they become a hell of a lot more prominent and a lot more obvious as to where the issues are, because you're then starting to deal with people's future lives, not just what's immediately happened to them. And if you can't communicate effectively in that environment, and if you can't engage with communities and allow them to give you what it is that you need, which is the information that's relevant to them, then you can't come forward with, in my case, recommendations, or in an operational sense, strategies to actually improve the outcomes next time around.
Do you think that operational leadership, and this is a pretty tough question, but do you think that operational leadership really get what community engagement and comms bring to the table? Not in terms of outputs. I think they understand outputs, but in terms of that insight into what the community need. Because you said, we've got to give information to them in the way they are asking for it, or in the way they can understand. Do you think that message coming back into the table is being heard? I know we're there more often than we used to be.
Yeah, no, look, I'd say again, without being specifically critical to anyone anywhere, I think I've looked at this, I've played in the international space as well. We are no different to anybody else. So this is not a criticism of Australians or New Zealanders or otherwise. As you said, intuitively, operational controllers and others know what it is that they need to say and what they need to do, but understanding the potential methods of doing that to achieve the right outcomes, and to understand how communities are potentially going to respond. And if you think about community, it's a very simple word in itself, but the concept of community is a very, very complex one, and one size doesn't fit all. So for me, I don't think we do. And the problem is, if you don't understand that and have a really good appreciation of it in peacetime, you don't have time in a reactive state to actually figure out what that means. And therefore you get the perverse outcomes.
It's really about understanding the subject matter expertise of this part of the puzzle. I've got a question that relates to that from Joni Brazel. She's happy to see the conversation happening. She would like to hear the thoughts of the three of you differentiating between communication, community engagement, and community development. And they are three areas of different subject matter expertise, and they come to the table with different things. She says that being at the table looks different for each of these different strategies when working with communities before, during, and after emergency. So I'll just throw that open to anybody who might have some feedback, because I think it's an interesting point.
Look, I'm happy if no one's going to jump in, just to give you an example, I guess, of I absolutely, whoever, I'm sorry, I don't know who that is, but great question, certainly.
Jody.
Yeah, and a very, and a great comment too. In my office, for example, I have 34 staff currently, which is not huge, but it's not a bad size. 34 staff, of which 3 of those are specifically involved in communication. I've got a senior communications strategist who sits across the top of most of this. I've got a senior strategic communications advisor who is within the office. And then for the Victorian Bushfire, the inquiry that we've just conducted, we engaged a senior program consultant who is a community engagement specialist and advisor. And the roles of those 3 are quite different. The first 2 are very, very related, but the third person that we engaged was someone who actually has specific experience in engaging directly with communities and actually understanding community thinking, community processes, community environments, and then bringing that back into the office so as the strategic communications advisors can build the strategy around that. And it's also the person that I use to go out and do my pre-work, if you like, and actually connect with communities to warm them up for me actually then conducting the inquiry. So we're starting from a base where they actually get it and we understand what it is that's really important to them. And they are different, very, very different functions. If I took that community engagement advisor out, the last one I mentioned, what I'd have is good strat comms capability, but I wouldn't necessarily have really good in-depth engagement capability specifically with communities.
And interestingly, in some organisations that I've worked with, those 2 teams are under different parts of the organisation. So community engagement can be functioning without, really strong connections to the comms functions. Michelle or Leah, any other different insights?
Yeah, I think one of the things that will help in this space, in New Zealand at least, is that the SIMS function, the SIMS edition, which we adopted last year, has a much more nuanced approach to public information management now, and there are more sub-functions sitting within that than there used to be. So we used to have the same model as I think you have with AIMS, where it was simply media, warnings and information and community. And now we have more sub-functions within that, which explicitly include stakeholder engagement, community liaison, internal communications, stratcoms, and others. And that opens the door for more of the community engagement lens, community development, particularly going into the recovery space, I think, rather so much than in response. But what that does is enables our profession of, I think of it as a profession of public information management, to evolve so that we have a contemporary practice, and it better reflects what the public expects of us. It doesn't mean that we can immediately stand all of this up in a response immediately, but in a long-running response, as things evolve, we can bring more of that community engagement, community development lens to what's going on. So in New Zealand, at least, I think we have the opportunity to do what Jodie's alluding to, rather than just a pure communications lens.
And it does go to the articulation of the subject matter expertise. It names various aspects of the job of being an excellent communicator in emergencies. There's actually another question here or a comment here from Simon, who talks about getting internal comms people integrated into readiness training and response exercising. So the shock going into public information is reduced and the relationships are already there. Is that something that any of you have experienced being achieved or not being achieved? Getting the comms and ops people together beforehand?
We all have secondary roles, so our comms teams will definitely jump into public information, and it's quite an agile system now. So yeah, it's from a QFES point of view, we're definitely pulling capability from within.
Any other thoughts about that? Are we connecting before the events happen?
I'm seeing that a lot in New Zealand now. That the PIM training is it's essential that if nothing else, you give people an appreciation of the environment they're coming into. And I think the trap that we have fallen into in the past with public information management is that we have a ready pool, if you like, of people we can draw on with the skill sets we want. We have comms people, we have community engagement people and what have you. So we think, right, we'll bring them and put a purple vest on them and make them PIMs. And they don't necessarily understand the operating environment, the speed and the pressure. And as Simon has said, there is a shock going into PIM, and some people are scared off for life, and it's awful. Whereas if they understood by training and involvement in exercises what they were going into, they could do the good job that they do without the awful shock that goes with it. So we are doing a lot of that here. We could always do more, I think. What
about the two Australian panelists?
Yeah, I think Rebecca, I think from a pure public information management perspective, then yes, it's absolutely, we do see it in the exercise environment, etc. So, and certainly, for how to work in incident control centres, etc. At that level, I think where it's less consistent though is actually above that. It's where you are exercising the strategic elements of a particular event, where the discussion is above the incident control centre, but it's about the whole of government or whole of sector strategic communication strategy that you're developing, where we probably don't see as consistent as I think we probably need to see people involved who have that expertise, who are there and are able to influence operational decision making, not in the context of changing an operational decision maker's mind about doing things that they are the subject matter expert in, but providing information that they may not be aware of in the way that someone's going to respond to what they're about to do, to allow a reconsideration of that, maybe that particular tactical strategy. So I think that's the part where we could do a lot more. And as I said, that's not just here, that's across the board as I've seen it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think it is a skill set as a communicator to learn how to bring our stuff to the table. Getting there is one thing, being very valuable there and translating our stuff into operational stuff is the next step. I have an interesting conversation for the Australian panel members, based on Michelle's articulation that the PIM role or what's your vision of AIMS? Sorry, Michelle.
It's SIMS, so it's Coordinated Incident Management System. Yeah.
So SIMS is articulating more specific roles for communicators. Do we think that AIMS could learn by that? Is it holding us back because it's simpler than it could be? Anybody willing to comment on that? And in the messaging too, if you're brave.
Yeah, I'll give you a response to that. I actually don't think that AIMS is holding anything back. I think AIMS has a very clear and specific purpose, and it operates within a certain environment in a very, very structured way. However, I think, as I said before, emergencies are not fixed and static, and our environment is not fixed and static. Therefore, our systems can't be fixed and static. So as far as AIMS goes, whilst it has its place and it's very important, there are other things outside of AIMS, and whilst AIMS is operating at the strategic level, that need to be considered as well, that may then influence the way AIMS or parts of AIMS itself is operating at any given time. And I think it's about not putting an artificial divide between those things and looking at AIMS in isolation and thinking it's the be-all, end-all of everything. It is absolutely there for a purpose and does its job, but there are other things that need to be able to integrate with it and be influenced by or influence it.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Nicole comments that SIMS sounds similar to BIMS, which is the structure recommended for public information in biosecurity emergencies in Australia. And I mean, that's why I forgot SIMS, because there's NIMS and BIMS and there's so many, but essentially they are people trying to develop as simple a structure as possible to do the job. And that's the tension, isn't it? You have to make it simple enough to be useful on a very complicated day, but you need to also recognize the reality, and the reality is complex. And I suspect that emergency management organizations the world over are living in that tension. Another aspect of the seat at the table that some of you might be able to speak to or be willing to speak to is the political context in which we work. Any significant emergency has political consequences, and you know, certainly that is recognised. There's certainly some research to say that, you know, subsequent to Katrina, 3 layers of American political leadership lost their jobs at the next elections. Doing this, being perceived to not do this well, can be career limiting. So politicians do care about what we do. Is there something that communications people need to learn to work in that space, or need to do to work in that space effectively? Who's brave?
Go on, Leah, then I'll say something. You go.
What do communications? Goodness, I suppose it's all about our systems and processes and how effectively we're actually our relationships. You know, it's all about relationships. So I worked in within a media team before. I worked previously as a senior media advisor for Queensland Rail, and then I've worked within our own media team at QFES, and I think it's just understanding and being really acutely aware of your political environment, I suppose. From an engagement point of view, being also, our approach is that we always look at engaging our people, our partners, and our community. So just understanding how all of our stakeholders align and fit within the process. I might hand over to you, Tony.
Look, I guess, you know, I've always said, I've always practiced the belief and always said to others that, you know, every community emergency is a political emergency. That's the reality of life. So therefore, if you choose to ignore that and not manage the political emergency at the same time, you do so at your peril, and you also do it at great risk of getting good outcomes for the community as well. You need to, though, acknowledge what you can influence and what you can't. And we all know, those of us who work within the government structures understand that at times, and if you look at COVID as a great example, the response to COVID across the world has seen a significantly greater injection of political thinking through communications and influence then at times on operations and otherwise, regardless of whether it was intended or not. But we've seen that actually happens. That is a fact of life. It happens. Some of that you can influence, some of it you can't. So you need to know how that is. And I think, as Leah said, you know, having people within your organisation who are not just subject matter experts on communications, but actually have political awareness as well and have worked in that environment, it's important that they are there to help you do what it is that you've got to do, because they will know where you can tread and what you can't. The other thing is, I always say it's really very, very important to make sure that you've got everything in good, full view of everybody. If you're going to be influenced by something that's going to impact you or your decision making or your community outcomes or the community safety outcomes that you think you want to achieve, and it's being influenced by others, others can't do that without having some ownership of it. They have to be partly accountable for that, and you can't allow yourself to be an island and suffer the potential consequences of it. So providing good advice back up to allow people to be aware of the potential consequences is critical. And again, without someone who's got that political savvy as well as good comms skills, you can't do that.
Michelle, do you think in your experience that is a good enough overlap? Do emergency comms professionals tend to have political savvy as well?
Well, that's a very broad question, and I think in
It is.
every emergency you'll have, some people in any part of the response who are very politically aware, and some who are either they don't bring that political nous with them, or they are just head down, bum up, doing what they need to do. And I think the role of strategic comms in any large scale emergency is where you would be being cognizant of the political expectations, the political risks, the reputational risks, rather than at the sort of operational level where the likes of me might sit. What I have noticed in probably the last 5 or 6 years is that the ministers of civil defence and emergency management that we've had in New Zealand have been very conscious of the importance of communication at the response level, and have gone out of their way to support organisations like EMPA by coming to speak at our conference, for example, by particularly taking note of what the PIM team is doing and endorsing that work, which in turn helps us achieve that seat at the table that we want. So having politicians of influence who recognise the importance of communication in the emergency concept has been very, very helpful to raise the profile of our profession and help us get that seat.
Rebecca, if I could just add something before we move
Absolutely.
on, if I could, I think there's a couple of things too that are important in this. From an operational perspective, it's really important to acknowledge that if you have a look over the last decade, going on probably 15 years now, we have seen a greater occurrence of political leaders and political figures actually being front and centre when emergencies are occurring. So it is now, they are there at the front in the same way as all of us and others are. And they're a very important piece of that. We need to acknowledge that, because it's actually our political leaders, most of whom when they're there are there because they're representing their particular constituents and the concerns as they understand them. That actually helps enable us to do what we've got to do. That's the first thing. And the second one, of course, is there's this whole issue of if we don't support our political leaders to do what they need to be able to do during an emergency, we actually contribute potentially to an erosion in confidence in government. And that's the last thing we or the community needs, to have a situation where our communities don't have confidence. And, you could say, listening to the COVID debate, that, lots of community members don't have confidence. But the reality is, I think if you were to look at the percentage of those people that make that noise, they are reasonably small against the broader population. And that community confidence thing is absolutely critical that we help maintain that.
One of the things I've noticed in many emergencies is the community don't divide the players up. In other words, they don't say, I don't trust that politician, but I do trust that doctor and I like that emergency management person. They go, the response or the recovery. So I take your point, Tony, that we do actually have to work together because they're not dividing us up. And if we want to maintain trust, it's got to be trust in all of us. Leah, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to mention Get Ready Queensland, our overarching preparedness campaign is undoubtedly supported through the government here and the Minister for Police and Emergency Services. We are always really lucky to have the support leading into our disasters, where we have statewide reach and working with QRA on that project. So, yeah.
I've got a question from Andrew. Would any of our panelists like to comment on these concepts in the context of COVID-19, both with regard to response to the pandemic itself and also through that lens with other potential incidents? So I don't know if any of you are specifically involved in COVID messaging, but from the perspective even of expert observers, how do you see the connection between the operational rollout and decision-making and the comms that are also being rolled out in your separate patches? Anybody want to speak to that a little bit?
Here I go again. Yes, I guess So I do have, as I said, in Victoria, I've got a monitoring function of the way in which our state has responded to COVID, which means that I actually get to see all of the processes, which include the comms processes and so on as well. And that's why I alluded to COVID before, because I think in our lifetime, it's probably the greatest example of everything, anything you want to find about emergency management, emergency response, about health management, etc., and the relationships between them has been exposed to us throughout the COVID emergency. There's no doubt about that. And this issue is no different. But I think what it's really done is it is a rare occurrence where we have an emergency, no matter how big, that every part of the community and every part of government is affected by and is involved in the response to. So as a result of that, what it's probably done is actually heightened the visibility for all of us of the particular areas in which we work. And as I say, I'm not a comms person, but for you guys, you would have seen more and heard more and asked more questions about communications issues in COVID than you probably ever would in a cyclone or a fire or a flood or an earthquake situation, because whole of community is impacted, whole of government is impacted, and that political overlay comes to play, the operational relationship with comms people is in play, and everything we've talked about thus far is heightened, if you like, from that perspective. So I think COVID has been just the perfect case study, and we're doing a public health emergencies review at the moment where COVID is the case study that we're using as a part of that in Victoria. And I can guarantee you that the idea of that is to make sure that we do not miss this once in a lifetime, for most of us, opportunity to learn the real lessons that come out of an event like this.
Every single person, and over an extraordinarily long period of time, which we do not usually face in emergency. Leah, you were going to add something?
Yeah, from a partnership perspective, we've been working really closely with Multicultural Australia, and way back at the beginning, I was sitting on the Human Social Recovery Committee and listening in there. And what was very interesting was that Multicultural Australia set up a Zoom meeting that was statewide where all of the community leaders could hook in. It was so they could communicate. It was a safe environment to talk about the challenges and solutions, and then feed back through to the appropriate committees so as the messaging could get down to the ground properly. Over the last couple of months, they've asked to extend that out to start talking more about emergency management and how we can better work together before, during and after events, which is, again, an incredible opportunity through ongoing partnerships with different sectors of the community so as we can communicate effectively. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a workshop where we can have a journey experience and speak to those community leaders about specifically preparedness, but then we'll do different workshops on the different phases. So yeah, there's so many great opportunities. Yep.
There's a very big table there, Leah.
Yeah,
it's a very, very big table, and
one of my favourite tables.
and obviously one of the issues around this table is who brings the community voice. And you know, an ongoing challenge to make sure the right community voice is brought. Michelle, any thoughts about the COVID, you know, management and comms in New Zealand, which is slightly different to ours?
Yes, it has been, and I want to be very careful not to comment on areas that I have no particular expertise in, but I have an observer's interest in this. Yeah. And I think last year New Zealand's COVID communication at a government level was widely praised, including overseas. And this year has been very much more challenging. And I think what that shows is something that we all inherently know, but sometimes forget, and that is that the emergency you face today will be different to the one you faced the last time, and will need an evolving approach. And our communications have to evolve with it. The audience has changed, the channels that we use, the voices we use to carry the messages, the language, the receiving environment will have changed. And even in a long-running event like this pandemic, the approaches that we have used before will not serve us this time or the next time either. Yeah.
So it's learning the lessons, but keeping an open mind.
Well, it's great to say, well, look, this worked really well, and look, we got, you know, everybody said what a great job we did, and not just that, you could see the unity of purpose across the country, largely, I think, influenced by very, very strong, clear, relevant, timely communication. The trick is to think, right, that playbook worked, but it won't necessarily work this time. How do we need to update it? What do we need to do differently? I'll just leave it at that, I think.
It's a complicated space. And as Tony mentioned, perfection is, you know, is way out there on the horizon behind me, rather than close at hand, you know. I'd love to hear from the three of you about some experiences you've had or stories you've heard about of specific examples in which being at the table together really had an impact, or not being at the table really caused a problem. Whichever one. I'd probably prefer the good news stories, but whichever ones you've got, I'd be really interested to understand how, like, some of the detail about how we get together well and what that looks like and what it causes to happen.
Okay. How we get together. So again, for me, it always comes back to the relationships, building those sustainable long-term relationships, and it only ever works effectively if we've all got an understanding of the common purpose. And for an organisation like QFES, it's all about community. How can we best work with our community, and as long as we're focused on that, then obviously the outcomes are going to deliver. I think what's really interesting in our space is, and if I'll speak specifically from a prevention preparedness point of view, we've got so many different people around the table now. Like I mentioned, when we're working with our partners like Red Cross, when we're working with insurance sector, when we're working with our government partners like the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, when we're working with our volunteers, SES, RFS, when we're working with our paid staff. I think that through the unity of purpose, that's how we get the job done, you know. But I must say, we're still in a situation where, you know, we only have one community engagement officer in each of our regions. We have emergency management officers as well. We're definitely under-resourced for what we need to deliver, and that's a fact. And I think something that I've been using recently, which is really important, is the Australian Business Roundtable. And sorry to Michelle, but this is such a great document, have just released their 6th report looking at the economic costs of natural disasters in Australia. And hands down, Queensland is going to face nearly 40% of the, or be impacted with 40% of the national costs for natural disasters. So we really need to, be more prepared. And I'm just hoping that this new information can help with that. But yeah, I think it is important to note, though, that we have more people around the table than we ever have before. And I just, it's encouraging.
You make an important point, though, Leah. If, you know, you need to get a job first to be at the table. So a real mark of how important organisations actually think engagement is, or comms is how many staff are employed. And then, you know, obviously how high up, as Tony said, their influence goes into the decision making. Tony and Michelle, any Awesome. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So if anybody's got some other questions, please put them online. But in the meantime, Michelle and Tony, any thoughts about, you know, an experience where it really did come together?
Yeah. I can give you one from last year, but its origins were a few years ago. So the bad news story first, there was a very large fire burning in a community not far away, shall we say. And the offer was made of public information assistance, and the word came back from the operational leaders, we'll call you when we need you. In fact, I think they might have said, we'll call you if we need you. And of course, the time they needed somebody was at 3 o'clock in the morning when things were starting to go sideways. So some lessons were actually learnt and absorbed by the right people in that particular place. So last year we had a very significant wildfire at Lake Oahu, which is in the middle of the South Island. The largest loss of property in any bushfire in New Zealand ever, 48 houses, which I know in the Australian context is very small, but in New Zealand was absolutely devastating. The miraculous thing was everybody got out. But the critical thing about that was because some of the people who had been involved in that previous incident were involved again, there was no question that public information management needed to be activated immediately and have a seat at the table. So when it came to the media questions, you know, the media demands to go in and have a look at what had happened, it was very easy for the PIM at the table to be able to say, we put the community first, we say we do. We are not going to be in the situation of taking the media in so that people see on television or on social media what has happened to their houses. So we were able to influence getting buses put on to take the residents in first to see what had happened to their properties. And then when they'd got back, we turned one of the buses around and took the media through. And there was a promise made at the time as well that when the results of the fire investigation were completed, the community would hear it first, directly from us. And that promise was made good last week. So that to me is a terrific example of what public information management, which is comms and engagement with a vest on, if you like, will achieve when we are at the table with the right relationships in a response or in recovery. So to me, you know, to all those out there who are thinking, well, I haven't got the seat at the table and it's all very well for you, you've been doing it for yonks, you know, keep working at it, chip away, build the relationships, take the opportunities, and that puts us in the right place to be able to advocate for the community when we need to. So that's my good news story.
That's beautiful, Michelle. There's so much in that. And one of the things that I was thinking about is credibility comes from alignment between what you say and what you do. And comms are the people who can manage that and advocate for that, which will give credibility to the whole response or the whole recovery effort. And also, and this one might lead into you, Tony, that I recalled, which I think also comes from Bruce Esplin, the idea that a lesson identified is not necessarily a lesson learned, but in your case, it was a lesson learned. And that's a wonderful thing to hear. Tony, would you like to wrap us up with any experiences that you've been in or heard about where it really did work?
Yeah, look, I guess similar to Michelle's, I think the 2015 Wye River Jamison Track bushfire here in Victoria, which happened on Christmas Eve, was a good example with very similar sorts of on-the-ground outcomes with busing communities through the areas, allowing them to see the impact for themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Those sorts of practical things occurred, and they occurred because there was significant input from communications advisors and strategists and so on, as well as to how that might work. But I guess the problem, not the problem, but the problem with trying to have that occur on a much larger scale is it's a very different issue altogether. Wye River was a reasonably contained, geographically contained event, and whilst it had a really big impact on that particular community and destroyed a lot of homes in two particular settings, to be able to then, in the height of a 2019-2020 fire situation that's occurring across a significantly greater area and many, many more communities, to get the consistency across that can be difficult. So I think it's about principles. It's about saying at the front end, whoever it is that is actually has got the most power and the most control in the comms environment in relation to that emergency, if a significant part of their focus is making sure that that power and that advice is able to be disseminated across all of the various geographical areas of an emergency, I think you'll get a far better outcome. The other thing I'd say too is that, again, it's not, we're not, since 2009, if I just think back as far as that, and we go back a lot further, obviously we've had a lot of emergencies since the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. And I think there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. I say in various presentations that I now consider Victoria to be a learning jurisdiction. 2009, I wouldn't have said that. In fact, 2009 occurred in part because we had sat back very happily looking at what had occurred post-1983 Ash Wednesday, and had lived on those things. And many of the fires you're talking about that Bruce Espin, who I was a deputy for at the time, was looking at when he was reviewing and inquiring, were very, very big events, much bigger than Ash Wednesday geographically, much bigger than 2019-20, but they didn't have impacts on actual community settlements. Therefore, it wasn't seen to be as big an issue. But the minute you get community impact, then you have a very different environment to play in. So I think it's, we have come a hell of a long way, and I'm sure everybody else has. And you're right, lessons identified, until they are actually implemented and acquitted, they are not lessons learned. And I think that's an intuitive understanding of most nowadays, which is good.
Yeah, it is. I think we've got hardly any time left. Who would like to give us some insights, perhaps, for people who aren't yet at the table? What's one idea that can get them there? If they're going to take something in their hot little hand and give it a go, what are they taking?
I think they're going to build a relationship. If you can't get through the door, get through the window. It's a truism, but there will be somebody there who is already in that circle who will appreciate that you need to be there too. So start building those relationships ahead of time. That will help.
Absolutely.
You need to have a value proposition too. If you can't describe to someone why you need to be there and have them walk away going, that's why I need that person or that service, then you're not going to get there anyway. So you actually need to know what your own value proposition is. Otherwise, you'll never get a seat at the table.
And it's all about the coalition of the willing. So, finding your peeps and connecting with them and coming at it collectively with collaboration. Yep.
And I would also add, make the relationship and make the plan. If you offer a really clear-cut articulation of what you're bringing, you might get into the door. I would thank you all so very much for your brilliant insights. It was extraordinary to hear some of your experiences and perspectives from such different positions, different countries, different roles. But I think we're coming together in a sort of acknowledgement of where we're going. We're not there yet. We're not perfect yet, Tony, but step by step, we will get somewhere that is for this time, for this circumstance, for this new time in which we're communicating to people who need our help. So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. I'm looking at the chat. That's where I'm looking to say thank you to everybody who has come, put interesting stuff on the chat and asked questions and listened hard. We look forward to seeing you and hearing from you at our next conference and our next webinar. Bye-bye, everybody.